Hello and welcome to the International Society for Physical Activity and Health podcast. Today's podcast is one in a series of 9 podcasts on the 8 investments that work for physical activity. The 8 investments that work for physical activity are a call to action for everyone, everywhere, including professionals, academics, civil society and decision makers, to embed physical activity in national and subnational policies. It's time to get into our podcast for today with your host, Matthew Tepi Mclaughlin.
Okay, I'm here today with Dr. Paul Kelly, who has been involved in ISPAH for a number of years and recently stepped off the treasurer role. How are you doing, Paul?
Very well, thanks. Nice to see you, Tepi.
All right. So your investment was that you led was the public education, including mass media. So could you tell us a little bit about that investment?
Yes, I think I like this investment. It's the one I think that highlights well how it's a systems level approach that obviously ISPAH Best Investments is advocating, because we know well that kind of public education and messaging and communication won't do anything on its own, because if there aren't also the opportunities and the accessibility and the capabilities for people to do activity, then you can get someone as motivated to be active as you like, but if there isn't somewhere to go and be active, it's going to have no effect. But vice versa, you can build all of the most excellent facilities and infrastructure. If people don't know it's there or don't want to use it, similarly, they may remain sort of dusty on the shelf, so to speak. So for me, the public education and the mass media is a really nice example of how things work together. So it's our way of helping people be aware of the benefits and also helping them be aware of the opportunities, and finding strategies that hopefully make them more confident, more motivated, more self-efficacy to be active.
Yeah, it's interesting. That's how I look at this investment as well. It pulls together the other ones in a way, and kind of ties them together. And we had both podcasts from Professor Jasper Schipperijn, who was talking about the actual physical environment. And yeah, without the combination of all of these things alone, that it's not about doing things alone, is it? It's about doing things together. So
we agree with Jasper.
Yeah, we can all nod. So why is this investment important to boost levels of physical activity?
Well, I suppose building from what I said in the previous answer, it speaks to a number of the sort of known, I guess, mechanisms or pathways, to being more active. So, it allows people to address their knowledge of the benefits, or rather, it allows us to address people's knowledge of the benefits. It speaks to things like motivation. It speaks to things like confidence. It speaks to things, I guess, self-efficacy as well. There, I think I mentioned this as well. It's not just being aware of the benefits, it's being aware of the opportunities and how to be active and how active to be. And something that's really coming out of, I would say, out of the research in recent years is there was for a long time, we kind of assumed that if we tell people that being inactive is bad for their cardiovascular or metabolic health, they would make the rational choice and become more active. And of course,
we've seen a lot of that. Yeah, this much percentage reduced death, or this. Yeah, we've seen a lot of that.
In 25 years' time, 20% increased risk of type 2 diabetes. I mean, I lost you at the first word. If you're a normal member of the population, it's great for us as academics and researchers and advocates. We all think it's great talking about that stuff.
Yeah.
But I think a lot of the research, even in the last 5-10 years, has started to kind of direct us more to can we speak to actually what people's motivations are when we're doing the mass media and the communication? So can we talk about mental health benefits? Can we talk about social benefits? Can we talk about how it's going to make them feel in the moment now, as opposed to some kind of obscure point in the future, where if you understand what hazard ratio is, you understand why there might be a benefit.
Yes.
So yeah, that's kind of for me how it's looking at the moment.
Yeah, so if it was public education, mass media, and using that example, then that's could come down to something at the very micro level, the difference between a poster that says one thing and the difference between a poster that says another. Yeah.
Absolutely. I mean, something that has been around for a while is this notion of, should it be gain framed or loss framed? That's kind of from the psychology. Should you talk about the things that will happen to you if you aren't active? The warnings, or should you frame it as, well, here's the benefits you'll receive right away. If you go for a walk with friends or family or the dog, or get outside, or play some sport or whatever it is. And while those messages have been around for a long time from psychology, I think the physical activity field and the research seems to be picking it up more than ever these days.
So, changing tack, who is it that needs to be involved in this investment to make it happen? Is it at those local council areas, or is it maybe it's the states or the counties, or is it at the highest level of the country, the federal level?
Well, I think, without dodging the question, I think it can work at all levels. We certainly in the UK and in Scotland, I don't know if the same is true where you are, Tepi. There are some pretty good national awareness raising campaigns now, but so that's at the national level. But at the school or the individual level, for example, we can still do really effective messaging and communication and education there as well. And obviously, as you zoom in more, you can become more tailored, more targeted to the intended recipients and audiences. And when you're at the national level, it might just be around saying, look, this is important enough that as a country we're taking it seriously. And does that on its own shift physical activity levels? No, of course not. But it contributes to the narrative, and it contributes to the systems approach of trying to bring as many people with us as we can.
Okay, so what are some of those key recommendations that you would say for people listening? What do we need to do in policy? What do we need to do in practice? And what do we need to do in research to further public education and mass media?
Oh, okay. So I think in policy, it's about implementation. So it's about saying, taking the current best evidence and the current kind of evidence-informed approaches and doing them. And like I say, there's evidence that that's starting to happen, and that's really good. From a practice point of view, I mean, what does that implementation look like? Well, we alluded to focusing on positives rather than negatives, maybe more of a narrative around social and mental, benefits and reasons, as opposed to, physical reasons. And, also being more tailored and targeted. So, understanding that the sort of education and messaging that might work for office workers may be different to older adults, which may be different to primary school children. Now, that seems obvious, but that's, I think, a clear area where we can do better as a field. There's clearly, you'll find good examples out there, but across the board, there needs to be improvement there. And in terms of research, I think there's kind of two levels. There's what's happening with physical activity researchers, and then there's what's happening, more broadly. And I think physical activity researchers, and it's getting really good. Like, there's some really great work from Canada, from the United States. There's some work going on in the UK as well now, and I'm sure there's others I'm not even aware of yet. Trying to, raise the profile of this work within the field of physical activity. I also think what researchers are doing and need to do is reach out to other areas with expertise. So, for example, smoking cessation has a long history of quite effective public education and messaging. Social marketing is an entire discipline that has been dabbled in, but I think a lot closer links between physical activity research and social marketing would be beneficial.
Can we learn from the converse? Can we learn from the promotion of those, say, the promotion of alcohol, for instance? Can we learn things from things like that?
So, great question. So I mentioned smoking, you mentioned alcohol. There's also things like drink driving, and there's also things like, food communication education, where generally we're trying to ask people to do less of something or to not do something. And the conversely, on physical activity, we're asking them to do something. So we've got to be careful that we can't draw direct parallels from what worked, a fear-based campaign around smoking cessation or around drink driving. But clearly there are going to be evidence-based principles that will be helpful to us. So, but I think what you maybe were alluding to in your question is clearly there are things, across the advertising and marketing world from, maybe I shouldn't mention big soft drinks or, alcohol brands, but, car brands, clothing brands, aftershave and perfume brands, they've got really, really good at claiming a market share and maintaining people to do a behavior. And I do think when you look at the way they advertise their products, there's quite a difference in how we advertise ours, if you like. Now, not much big budgets and huge teams, and that has to be taken into account. But I do think there might be some lessons about what they think works to motivate people to do stuff.
Yeah. What strikes me is I think that they know as well that if they stopped doing advertising completely of anything, it wouldn't be the be all and end all for the product. So it just reinforces that it is a part of a system, and there's other things that influence people's decisions, like the cost or the accessibility, and so it is a system, and I think that ties it in really nicely for a close. So if there's anything else you'd like to add, anything we might have missed?
No, for all researchers, listen in, and professionals and practitioners, policymakers, do think about this best investment, because I think, like you said, Tepi, it's one that ties them all together rather than one that we would ever argue should stand alone as an approach.
Great. Thanks for joining us today, Paul.
No worries, Tepi. Thanks.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's podcast. But if you haven't done so already, I'll encourage you to subscribe to your favourite podcast channel. The International Society for Physical Activity and Health podcast is available on all of the leading podcast channels, including Apple, Spotify, Google. If you've got an idea for a podcast, you can send that through to info@ispah.org. Thank you very much for listening, and we hope you can join us on our podcast again soon.